Good morning, everyone. I'm Sharianne Farquharson, Knowledge Management and Capacity Development Expert for the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. One moment, please. Just a little technical difficulties this morning. All right. Welcome to the Integrated Resource and Resilience Planning series of capacity building sessions brought to you by the Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, CROIX, and facilitated by the kind financial support of the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, with technical support from the German Corporation for International Cooperation, GIZ, through the Climate Resilient and Sustainable Energy Supply, CROIX project. Our partner agencies presenting today are the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, and GetInvest. The participation of our colleagues from NREL is facilitated by the financial support of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. These sessions are designed to address critical elements of the integrated resource and resilience planning process. As the CROIX works with stakeholders towards developing IRRPs for several Caribbean countries, our aim is to build institutional capacity and to ensure that we have experts in energy planning across the region. Planning for the future of the electricity sector requires an appreciation of the technical issues arising from grid expansion with renewable energy integration, as well as responding to demand-side changes. Energy storage, which is critical to building resilience, particularly as we increase the share of renewables on the grid and intermittent renewables in particular, will be the focus of our session today. We have a bonus for this, our final session in this series, as we will also include a presentation on the CROIX Project Preparation Facility, PPF. And the PPF is designed to ensure that you have the support to bring your renewable energy and energy efficiency projects to bankability. At this time, I'll invite James Ellsworth from NREL to speak on the NREL USAID partnership. James?
Yes, good morning, everybody. This is James Ellsworth from the United States Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the Resilient Energy Platform. I'm a research engineer there focused on resilient power systems planning. So I'm here to help welcome you to this webinar on battery storage for resilience. Quick, I'll cover a few housekeeping items. For all attendees, you will be automatically muted upon joining the webinar. We will have several question and answer sessions throughout between several of our speakers today. Please add any comments or questions in the chat box on Zoom. And if you have any technical issues, please reach out directly to Galen through the chat. So as Sharianne mentioned, this webinar and the other webinars in this series that NREL has been part of has been sponsored for the United States Agency for International Development and National Renewable Energy Laboratory Partnership in cooperation with CROIX. So USAID provides this type of regional technical support and coordination through their Caribbean Energy Initiative, or the CEI, which is focused on helping energy systems across the region become more resilient in the face of threats, both physical and virtual. The USAID NREL partnership overall is a partnership to deliver clean, reliable, and affordable power to the developing world. And this partnership addresses critical aspects of deploying advanced energy systems in developing countries through policy, planning, and deployment support, and global technical toolkits. Those global technical toolkits include the four that are shown here: the Renewable Energy, or RE Explorer, which provides renewable energy data and geospatial analysis tools. Green the Grid is a platform that can help support countries in power system transformation and grid modernization. IJEDI, or the International Jobs and Economic Development Impacts Model, It's a free online tool for analyzing potential impacts, economic impacts, and jobs benefits from renewable energy projects around the world. And then there's the Resilient Energy Platform, which is managed by NREL and provides expert resources, training materials, and tools to enhance power sector resilience. It allows decision makers to assess power sector vulnerabilities, identify resilient solutions, and make informed decisions to enhance power sector resilience at all scales. So I'm really excited about this webinar. This session in particular will be a great one to wrap up the series. We've got a star-studded lineup of knowledgeable, experienced, and engaging speakers here. We'll have the speakers introduce themselves as we go through the presentation because we have a jam-packed lineup here. But overall, I just want to say thank you all for joining us today and look forward to this session and collaborating in the future. A brief overview of our agenda here. We have several different speakers and sessions that are outlined here. We'll start off with an energy storage and resilience overview from Eloqvist from NREL. And then we'll have several different case studies or examples of various scale battery storage and solar and some other types of energy too. Various case studies focused specifically on island situations throughout the world. And as you see here, we've got question and answer sessions between every one or two speakers throughout. So make sure as you come up with those questions, enter them in the chat. Otherwise, because we've got such a big lineup, I'll hand it back over to Sherry Ann to kick us off. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Thanks, James. And we really do appreciate this partnership that the CREIX has forged with NREL and USAID. And so this morning, participants, we look forward to an interactive and a very productive session. We remind you to enter your questions in the Q&A throughout the session. And when we pause, we will take those questions. And so without further ado, we invite you to listen to Emma Eloqvist.
Thanks, James. Are you presenting the slides? All right, I see it. Great, thanks. So my name is Emma Eloqvist. I am a research engineer at NREL and focus most of my research around techno-economic analysis of energy storage and other distributed energy resources. You can go on to the next slide, please. So today I'll give an overview of some techno-economic considerations for using energy storage, both to provide cost savings, but also to help with sort of resilience challenges. So as was mentioned in the intro, there's changes happening in the electric power system. Renewable energy resources and technologies are growing worldwide as a result of cost decreases. Generation is becoming increasingly distributed with 31% of new capacity going in behind the meter. And renewable energy systems are being coupled more often with battery storage to provide both cost savings and resilient energy solutions. And one of those reasons is because existing backup power is sometimes not sufficient. So this is a photo of a diesel generator that's actually on our research campus. Some of the challenges with diesel generators include there's oftentimes a limited amount of fuel available for backup diesel generators because the amount of fuel you can store in a given location can be limited due to either financial or regulatory constraints. In the event of a power outage, it can also be difficult to resupply backup diesel generators because natural disasters may have damaged the fuel supply chains, or there may be a limited amount of fuel available and it might have to be diverted to higher priority needs. Diesel backup generators are not used very frequently. and if they're not maintained properly, have a high probability of failing. So a recent study conducted at the lab found that poorly maintained diesel generators have a 50% probability of lasting 48 hours. And in addition to those technical challenges, backup generators typically cannot monetize value stream and are not typically grid connected. Next slide, please. So because of that, those challenges, battery storage can have an enhanced role for resilience. For some historical context, battery storage has for a long time been used as an uninterruptible power source to serve very critical loads like servers, for example. These batteries are typically kept at a 100 or close to 100% state of charge, and they're not used for additional purposes. And so they're able to provide sort of seamless power in the event that the grid were to go out, but the duration of those is typically a few minutes to at most a couple of hours. However, when you couple these batteries with renewable or other distributed energy generation technologies, they can provide backup generation for extended periods of time, days or weeks or possibly even longer. Batteries also have some additional benefits. They can decrease the size of other backup generation needed. So you might be able to couple a battery and downsize a diesel generator. They're able to extend a limited fuel supply. So you could power the sort of system with the battery and let's say solar PV, for example, and turn down or turn off a diesel generator to save some of that fuel. They can provide a second set of redundancy. They also have the ability to potentially provide sort of a fully renewable backup system that does not rely on fueling. Also, as I mentioned, battery storage systems can provide revenue streams when grid connected. And so today's presentation will cover some considerations for using battery storage for backup power and also for generating revenue while grid connected. It is mostly focused on techno-economic considerations, so I'm not going to cover today other resilience consideration related for things like citing best practices, for example. Okay, so to help orient kind of what a battery can do, and this is focused mostly here on customer-sided battery storage systems. We've laid out 4 different use cases here. So those are the 4 use cases listed across the top. And then for each of those 4 use cases, we have a description, talk about sort of under what conditions it would work, and then describe what the primary power supply would be in this use case, and then what's used for backup. So the first use case on the left is the UPS, which I mentioned earlier. So here the battery is sort of sitting at a high state of charge and ready to be discharged in the event of a grid outage. This works for sites that have very critical loads with sort of a zero tolerance for disruption or downtime. The primary power supply here is the utility grid, and then in the event the grid goes down, the UPS is used as a backup. Next is off-grid renewable energy and storage systems. So these provide continuous power in lieu of a utility. So these systems we often see at remote sites that may have really high fuel costs or sites with very low grid reliability. So here the distributed energy resources typically including generators, provide the primary power supply. Generally, these systems are not sort of impacted by utility grid disturbances. And then furthermore, the sort of different technologies within an off-grid system can provide redundancy. So a battery and storage might be able to provide redundancy to the diesel generator. Next is grid-connected islandable battery storage systems. So these, often coupled with renewable energy such as solar PV, lower the cost of utility purchases while grid connected, and then also have the capability to provide backup power during an outage. So this works in locations where the utility rate has features where battery storage can provide savings. So that includes high demand charges or time of use rates, or where there may be wholesale markets that a battery is able to participate in and receive revenue for. And then in addition to that, because there are some additional costs associated with being able to island these systems, there also needs to be some resilience requirements at the sites. So while the grid is up and running, the grid and then also the on-site distributed resources provide the primary power supply. And then in the event the grid were to go down, the distributed energy resources and battery storage provide backup power. And then finally, sites can host large-scale battery and other renewable energy systems for off-site offtake. So they may be in a location where there's sort of high constraints on land, or they may have land in a particularly strategic location. And so they could work with a utility or other interested off-taker to receive some sort of compensation for hosting these large systems. And so the site would not use these systems themselves. So the primary power supply would be provided by the grid still. But in the event that the power were to go down, they can, if configured correctly, provide, turn that power inwards and provide power to the site. I believe Jim will sort of talk about one of these case studies in a little bit more detail. All right, next slide, please. So in thinking about siting a battery and sizing it, there's a lot of different factors that impact sort of what extent of cost savings and resilience they can provide. And in particular with battery storage, back of the envelope calculations are not really enough to determine project potential. So, you know, traditionally, maybe metrics like an LCOE, for example, has been compared to an average cost of electricity to a site. But with battery storage in the way that it's used, and as these systems and value streams are becoming more sort of complex and integrated, it's important to think about all the different consideration within one sort of problem statements. So things to consider include the value streams. So what sort of the value that the battery system can provide. What's the cost of electricity at a site that you could be offsetting with the system? What's the load of the site? So what's the shape of the site, and how could the battery be sized to best help meet that? And what are policies or incentives available to help sort of encourage the adoption of battery storage? Next slide, please. So I'll just show this chart here that goes over the value streams. I'm not going to go into detail on the other considerations quite yet. So there's lots of different services that battery storage can provide. Starting at the top is demand charge reduction and energy arbitrage. So those are primarily driven by the utility rate structure that an end customer pays. So the battery storage system can be used to sort of charge when either the load is low or when the rate is low, and then discharge to lower the load, especially during high demand or high time of use periods. Battery storage can also provide energy arbitrage on the wholesale market. So there's sort of emerging opportunities for behind the meter storage systems to participate in these and realize that value. Utilities may also offer demand response programs where battery storage, along with other distributed energy resources, can participate. And so here, the nuance is that the battery is not providing cost savings, it's sort of generating revenues. So the utility will pay participants to lower their demand at certain times of the year. There's also frequency regulation and capacity markets. That again, behind the meter battery storage sort of may have emerging opportunities to participate in. And then on the transmission and distribution side of things, batteries can provide voltage support and upgrade deferral. All right, next slide, please. All right, so what are some of the considerations for using battery storage for backup power? They include the critical loads at the site, so sort of the critical load that you'd want to serve in the event of an outage, the outage duration, so how long that outage is expected to last, any value of resilience that might be able to be quantified or monetized. And then there's some additional costs for being able to island a PV and storage system that should also be taken into consideration. So a critical load is the load to be served during a grid outage. It's typically different from the typical load. It can have a different shape, it can have a different magnitude, and it can have different timing of peaks. And the critical load will impact the technology selection and size for providing backup power. The critical load, while important, can also be challenging to accurately estimate. And so sites may have to go about different ways of kind of providing estimates of a typical load. There's also different levels of critical loads. So there may be some that are very critical and need to be met at all times, and some that are nice to have and can be met when there's excess generation. The figure on the right-hand side here shows some different ways of estimating a critical load. So it could be a percentage of the typical load. So sites may be able to say roughly 50% of my load is critical and needs to be met during an outage. There may be an actual submeter or critical load panel at a site where you can get sort of a very accurate sense of the critical load at a site. So those would be measured on like a 15-minute or hourly basis. And then you could also try to model the critical load based on kind of the end uses of the site. So you might know, specifically what type of equipment would need to be run and sort of build up a critical load that way. Next slide, please. Another consideration is the outage duration that you're planning for. So again, this is something that's maybe hard to know exactly to have sort of a precise number in mind, but some general guidelines can help determine the best technology selection. So if the outage that a site's planning for is only seconds or minutes, a battery UPS might be sufficient. If you're talking about an outage lasting for days, then battery, may be supplemented by renewable energy and traditional backup sources might be a good solution. And then if you're planning for outages lasting for weeks or longer, on-site fuel supply might not be sufficient. And so the site might want to consider, solutions that don't rely on a fuel supply. Next, I'll talk a little bit about this idea of quantifying, valuing, and monetizing resilience. So starting with quantifying resilience. So resilience metrics measure how resilient an energy system is. And there's lots of different ways of measuring that. It could be customer outage time, the amount of load not served, number or percentages of customers experiencing an outage, a number of critical services without power, time to recover, or cost to recover. So those metrics have a lot of different units, and usually are we're able to measure and quantify those. Next up is valuing resilience. So that would be determining the value of resilience investments in dollars or other currency, and can be an important component of a cost-benefit analysis. So that includes accounting for the avoided cost of an outage. That can be the loss of utility revenue, cost of grid damages, cost of recovery, avoided outage costs, loss of assets, and business interruption costs. And then finally, resilience monetizations determines what portion of the resilience value can be realized in cash flow to financial projects. And so these can be harder to sort of actually achieve, but there could be in the forms of a reduced insurance rate, reduced mortgage rate, government incentives, or grid service values. Here, I'll show an example of how you can kind of couple these resilience benefits with a techno-economic analysis to explore trade-offs between cost savings and resilience savings. And so we are looking at a site evaluating 3 different system configurations, a base case, a lowest cost, and a third alternative. So the base case here is a 2.5 megawatt generator. And for the site, the total life cycle cost of energy over the analysis period here, including sort of energy purchases and O&M and that stuff, is $20 million. And with the amount of fuel that the site has stored on site, they are able to survive an outage of 5 days or less with a 90% probability. So if you look down in the gray area in the chart, there's a dashed line at the 5-day mark, and that meets with that 90% probability. So the reason why this is a probability and not a number is because the amount of time that you're able to sustain an outage varies throughout the year, as both the load varies and energy, so solar resources, for example, vary throughout the year. So next in brown, the site is considering what would be the most cost optimal or lowest cost solution. So here they're coupling that same generator with a small solar and storage system. So the life cycle costs decrease from $20 million to $19.5 million. So they're saving $500,000 over this analysis period, and now are able to survive an outage for an additional day. So the 90% probability is 6 days. And then finally, they're considering this third solution in blue. So now the solar PV and storage sizes have increased quite a bit. And the life cycle cost has also increased from $20 million to $20.1 million. But in this case, they're able to survive an outage of 9 days with a 90% probability. And so while this doesn't provide sort of an answer for a site here, it allows the site to consider sort of pros and cons of various different solutions. All right, so that wraps up the first section, giving an overview of considerations for these battery storage systems. Next, I'm going to do somewhat of a recap. I think my colleague Dan presented on the REOPT model in great detail at a prior webinar, and so I'm just going to give a little bit of a refresher of that. So you can go on to the next slide, please. So REOPT is a model that we use here at NREL to evaluate these sort of solutions for our partners. There's a in-house model, that researchers use, and then a free publicly available model that anybody can use. It's accessed through a website. Both these tools, though, are mixed integer linear programs. So what that means is you provide information about a site, and then the model will provide you with sort of the optimal mix and size of technologies. So the first basic input to the tool is at the bottom in gray, the load of the site. So this can be both electric and thermal loads. And then those loads need to be met in each time increment throughout the year. So oftentimes we're looking at like an hourly or 15-minute analysis by any of the technology options listed on the left-hand side. And so here users can select which technologies they want to consider, including solar PV, wind, the electric grid, backup generators, energy storage, both batteries and thermal energy storage, and combined heat and power. And then the technology sizes and selection are also impacted by the drivers listed across the top. So the user can enter goals around minimizing the cost of electricity, providing resilience benefits, or lowering emissions. And then furthermore, it's driven by the economics. So the capital cost of the technologies, incentives, and other financial parameters, and then the utility costs that are being offset by these distributed energy technologies. The outputs are listed in green, so it includes the technology mix and size, dispatch or operation of the assets, and then project economics. So what's it going to cost to install and to operate, and what sort of the life cycle cost and net present value associated with that. Here is another look at sort of the output or how the tool works. The load of a site here is in black. Sorry, I was just trying to read the chat. And it's met by a combination of solar PV, battery storage, and the utility grid. And so the battery storage here in gray is being coupled by the PV system to lower the peak from about 27 megawatts here down to 23 megawatts. It's also shifting electricity at a later date here on a Thursday from early morning hours to the late afternoon to provide some energy arbitrage. And I know I'm sort of at time here, so I'll maybe end on the slide, James, to just show you that here's a link to the tool. It's available on the website. You can go and sort of explore. It's very user-friendly. It has both financial and a resilience focus that you can choose. And then you're able to select your technologies and then enter sort of basic information about your site. And that's all you need in order to evaluate these different options. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Emma. Don't go just yet. We do have a couple of questions for you. The first question came in from one of our participants. While you were speaking about backup generators, he's asking if you could explain some more the description where you said not providing monetizable value streams. This is as it relates to backup generators. If you could speak some more about this.
Yeah, so oftentimes there are sort of emissions or other constraints for diesel generators where you're not able to operate them for more than, let's say, maybe 50 hours a year or something like that. So unlike renewables and solar PV in a distributed setting where you can sort of use them on a daily basis or kind of continuously to lower the cost of on-site utility purchases. The diesel generators, oftentimes due to regulations and also some of the technical considerations, have sort of limited hours that they can operate. And so you can't use your diesel generator on a daily basis to provide demand reduction, for example. And furthermore, for some of these demand response programs that I mentioned, not all of them allow diesel generators to be used to provide that demand response capability.
Okay, thanks for that. The second question, we're asking for you to clarify how the life cycle cost is determined.
Sure, yeah, so life cycle cost of energy includes sort of all investments and costs and savings. And so it's the basis by which we compare different project economics. And so let's say your base case might be purchasing, your kind of end customer, and you are purchasing electricity from the utility. So detailing sort of what that cost is, and then how it's projected to escalate over, let's say, a 20-year time period. And so that would give you the life cycle cost of electricity. And so you may want to compare that to, say, investing upfront in year one in solar PV and battery. So that's going to be sort of a higher initial upfront cost. But then your annual expected utility payments may be lower. And so comparing that project over the same 20-year analysis period and taking into consideration sort of all the costs associated will allow for apples to apples comparisons of different energy projects.
Okay, all right, thank you. And one final question for this section. It looks like REOPT LITE reduces the concern about intermittent energy sources in grid stability consideration. So this would mean that solar power would seem just as effective as a fuel energy source with the right storage system, of course. So the question then is, well, two questions. Is cost the main drawback for the inclusion of storage? And also highlighting that we just had almost 3 dark days in Barbados after the La Soufrière eruption. So does storage cover this type of interruption in the supply of power?
Sure. Thank you for that question. Yes, I would say cost is sort of the primary limiting factor of energy storage. So while costs have come down significantly over the last 5 to 10 years, it's still relatively expensive. And so when you invest in storage, you have to very smartly be able to use that capacity of the systems to recuperate the initial cost. And so that's why you often see a storage system coupled with other generation technologies where, you know, other technologies can provide sort of the bulk of energy generation or demand reduction, for example, and then you can couple a smaller storage system with that, where it can really sort of provide the most value. And then the other consideration, of course, is that energy storage only lasts so long, so you need to charge it. So you can do that on a daily basis, or even more frequently, but you need something to charge the battery system in order for it then to be able to deliver the power. And so for something like a 3-day outage, I think you need a really large battery system. You know, if you just charged it and kept it at a high state of charge, then needed it to last for 3 days, that would be a really large system. But if you coupled it with solar PV, for example, you can maybe use the solar during the day and charge the battery and then just rely on the battery at night, rather than just a battery system. But, you know, I think with increased renewable energy power going into the grid, storage is certainly an enabling technology for that. So there's lots of research going on at our lab and other institutions too on technologies that could provide the same storage capabilities, but on that longer time scale. So days, or even thinking about seasonal storage. But we're just not quite there yet, and the costs are still somewhat prohibitive.
Okay, thank you so much, Emma. Really appreciate your responses. And now we will move to our second segment. We'll have two presenters, Otto van Geet, and he will be followed by Dan Ollis. So continue to post your questions, and we will take the questions for this segment after Dan has presented.
Good morning, everyone. This is Otto van Geet, and I wanted to present on a case study in Puerto Rico at the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the building's called the AVIARY. I'm an energy efficiency and renewable energy engineer at NREL. And with that, first I wanted to thank Emma, and then let's go to the next slide, James. So the AVIARY is an example of a PV hybrid power system that we evaluated. It's the mission of the AVIARY is to protect the endangered Puerto Rican parrot, and images shown at the right of the parrot. It's a remote site with very unreliable and expensive grid power, very frequent power failures, including the power failing for months after hurricanes. And the AVIARY has critical loads provided by diesel generators currently, and I'll describe those generators in the next few slides. Next slide. So we use the REOPT tool that Emma just talked about, and Dan had talked about it at a previous seminar, for evaluating solar plus storage at the facility. And then we used it to optimize the size for both cost and resilience. And we were looking at a couple scenarios, and I'll show you more details, but the AVIARY would like to run for 24 or maybe 48 hours without having to start the backup diesel generators. Next slide. The analysis methodology that was used was actually by Emma and team. From an economics point of view, the PV plus storage was sized by REOPT to maximize the savings, and I'll show you that. And then from that system, the outage benefits were calculated. On the resilient side, the same kind of thing, but the PV plus storage sized to survive utility outages at minimum cost. And I'll show you the results on that also. So next slide. Energy consumption data and cost was provided by the site, the Fish and Wildlife site, but it was on an annual basis, actually a monthly basis. The annual consumption was 93,000 kilowatt hours. This is a fairly small facility, 10,000 or so square feet, but we don't know the load profile. So we use the typical load profile of a small office, and it's climate zone 1A, hot and humid as you would expect in Puerto Rico. Next slide. So this is a synthesized load profile, again, based on a small office. And it's kind of a typical day-night profile, which would be expected given the occupancy of the aviary, that its highest loads would be during the day when most of the people were there. And we picked the highest month load of the year, hot summer month of June. And then the highest load week is shown at the bottom image here. And again, a peaking during the day and a little bit less at night for a 24 or 48 hour period was assumed. Go to the next slide. So the costs, PREPA is the utility there, and it provides general service at secondary voltage for loads lower than 50 kVA. And it's expensive electricity on the order of 23.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And it's broken down by these different rates shown here, and the link for those for this rate is shown in the bottom. So 23.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Next slide. Yep, next slide. Yeah, here we go. So again, the goal is to be able to survive a 24-hour outage or possibly look at a 48-hour outage without having to start the backup generator. We assume that the critical load is 50% of the typical load. If there's a grid failure, they turn off non-critical loads such as comfort air conditioning in some spaces. Existing assets are 60 kW generators. There's 2 of them. And 600 gallons of diesel fuel stored on site. Again, a lot of diesel given the history of extended grid outages. And we sizing the PV and storage to meet the outage survival requirements. Next slide. Some of the results in the base case, which is shown on the left, the life cycle cost is $365,000 with no renewables. We did look at a no net metering case, but as far as we can tell, based on regulatory requirements, net metering is available. So we'll focus on the box on the right. The PV size is constrained by available roof area to 26 kilowatts. So we use the 26 kilowatts in all examples. The grid connected optimal case, it does provide the best economics where it saves 16% on a life cycle cost basis, or provides net present value of $58,000. In all the net metering cases, the 26 kW PV would provide 39% or so of the annual energy. The case that was selected is the 24-hour outage case, same 26 kilowatts PV, but then 98 kilowatt hours of battery storage is added, which has a higher capital cost and life cycle cost, and is just slightly life cycle cost negative, but does provide significant resilience benefits that the site decided to pursue this path. We also did look at a 48-hour scenario, but the economics got significantly worse, as shown on the far right-hand side. None of the values of resilience are considered in this analysis. This is strictly straight economics. There is resilience benefits, but they're not included with this, with these results. Next slide. So the resilience benefits, there's a bunch of similar graphs to what Emma showed here. Starting on the left-hand side, the 24 or 48-hour battery sizes do provide some added resilience. The existing diesel generator is able to meet average outage durations for approximately 3 weeks based on the 600 gallons. So it does survive the current scenario of 24, 48 hours. There's also current, often short failures that they wanted to avoid running the generator. But importantly, so that's the black curve in the middle showing about 3 weeks. If you had a 24 or 48 hour battery size, you can double those survival times to 5 or 6 weeks instead of 3 weeks, because the PV and the batteries meet a significant portion of the load, again, 40 or so % annually, and the average survival time is greatly increased. So that's the results from a resilience point of view, and those are the graphs on the far, the green and the blue traces on the far right in the outage survivability. So next slide. The results and conclusions and next steps based on this analysis is again, PV is cost effective at the site, and it's constrained to 26 kilowatts because of limited roof area. It does take advantage of net metering. So it does provide a positive life cycle cost. Storage is not cost effective because federal agencies can't take take advantage of any available incentives, but it does provide significant resilience benefits. The diesel, again, could provide about 3 weeks of storage of resilience. The generator is oversized and running at low loads could have some implication on its efficiency and life. You don't want to run diesel generators for extended periods below loads of say 25% or so. And then PV and storage can be used to meet outage survival goals with a slight increase, 1 to 3% for a 24-hour outage sizing, or 13 to 15% for 48 hours, depending on availability of net metering. Again, they decided to go with the 24-hour scenario. Bids it was advertised with a storm hardened 26 kilowatt PV system mounted to the roof, other efficiency upgrades for the building, including a new roof and a 100 kilowatt hour lithium ion battery system. Bids have been received and are being evaluated by the agency as we speak. And hopefully the system will be awarded and installed sometime this summer. I think that would be my next slide, and we can go to the next slide. And I will take questions at the end of Dan's presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, good morning. My name is Dan Ollis. I'm also a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Lab. If I could just quick get a microphone check. Are you all hearing me okay?
Yes.
Yes, you're clear.
All right, thank you so much. Next slide, please. So today I'm presenting about some battery energy storage that is going in at the on the island of St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The utility has a number of planned projects, including conventional reciprocating engines, battery energy storage, and a number of renewable energy projects that they're installing throughout their system. But today I'm going to be focusing on the St. Croix system and the battery energy storage system that's planned there. These systems are all being installed for two purposes. One is integrating the renewable energy to reduce the fuel consumed. So it's definitely one of the primary objectives is to save money due to the high operating costs. But a significant component of the objectives is also the resiliency benefits. And so I will talk primarily about the resiliency, the way that's being approached on St. Croix. So there's two systems in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which I'm showing the map here. To the south is the island of St. Croix, which is where I'm focusing. Because St. Croix and St. Thomas are so far apart, there are actually two different systems operated there. There's no cable that connects the two. The utility there is the Virgin Islands Water and Power Authority, And the National Renewable Energy Lab is providing technical assistance to VA WAPA with funding from the U.S. Federal Energy Management Agency, as well as the Department of Energy. On the island of St. Croix, they're planning to install solar photovoltaics and battery energy storage. And if we could go to the next slide, I'll explain in a little more detail what the purpose of those systems are. But first, we'll talk about the existing system. So on St. Croix, they've got currently about a 38 megawatt peak, and the system averages at 30 megawatts of load. And the figure on the right, I'm showing about 2 weeks of load data for the month of January, which is the blue trace, and 2 weeks in the month of July. So you can see that the load is fairly regular, but it increases in the summer months due to higher air conditioning loads. The generation there is currently includes combustion turbines and reciprocating engines, and they've got 2 different fuel supplies, diesel and propane. And in addition to the thermal generation, they have an existing 4.2 megawatt solar photovoltaic system, a plant there that's currently being operated by an independent power producer. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what they're planning on integrating, in addition to the 4.2 existing megawatts of solar, they're planning on adding 2 fairly large solar plants. One is an 18 megawatt system and the other is a 10 megawatt system. In combination, they're going to add a large battery energy storage system that's currently spec'd at about 10 megawatts of power rating and 20 megawatt hour or a 2-hour battery of energy storage behind it. In addition to the solar and the battery energy storage, they're going to be upgrading the distribution system that will allow sectionalizing of the system to allow microgrid operation in case of an emergency situation. The detailed engineering has just begun, so these sizes are kind of conceptual and were used to solicit the funding. However, they're subject to change as the technical due diligence proceeds. The figure on the bottom just shows how much solar the planned plants are. The blue shows you the load over a typical year. And as I said on a previous slide, it's kind of averaging about 30 megawatts to 38 megawatt load. But if you integrate this much solar on the system, the net load is represented in orange. And what this represents is about 20 to 25% of the annual energy could come from these solar plants. But what the plot is intended to show is that at any moment, the solar represents an very high level of instantaneous power, and if it's uncontrolled, could result in a lot of technical operation challenges. Next slide, James. So here just geographically show you the system that is there. So this is a Google Earth image of the island of St. Croix. Up at the north island, or north end of the island, near Richmond is the power plant. And then there's a substation there, and then there's an existing substation, which is called the Midland substation, which is kind of in the middle of the island. It's at the Midland substation where the existing 4.2 megawatt plant exists. And then it's at that substation where the 2 new solar plants will be installed as well, and they'll interconnect at the Midland substation. Next slide. So the battery, the planned battery, the 20 megawatt battery, has kind of multiple uses. Firstly, under normal operations, it'll provide reserves. As you can see in the plot on the bottom right, there's some data here from the existing 4.2 megawatt solar plant. This is 2-second data. And what you can see is on certain days where, based on the weather, the power production on the solar plant could be very dynamic. And so what we're seeing is the power output is ramping up and down fairly rapidly. And the figure on the right shows the ramp rate in megawatts per second for this particular day for the existing 4.2 megawatt plant. So we're looking at, you know, a 4.2 megawatt plant has ramp rates of about 0.4 megawatts per second. So it's about 10% of the power output is dropping and rising at any moment due to these passing clouds. And so under normal operations, the battery will help manage the ramp rates of the solar system. It'll provide support to the existing thermal generations, because if the solar production drops, then the existing fossil fuel generators will have to ramp up to meet those. And so the battery will supplement that ramping capability. As I showed on that previous slide, also, the net load in some time steps could be negative, where there's actually excess PV. So the battery can be used to actually store some of that solar, and then be used later in the afternoon to do some afternoon load shifting. But importantly, also, the battery will provide reliability services in the form of being able to respond to certain contingency events. So certain contingencies might include the loss of a thermal generator. So the battery energy storage could pick up that if one of the fossil fuel generators trips off, or it could absorb a lot of power if one of the feeders trips off. So it'll provide, it'll improve the reliability of the system. But also, one of the severe contingency events is that the interconnection between the east end of the island and the west end of the island could go down, and the battery, in this case, will allow the west end of the island to actually form into a microgrid. And so the idea with the battery under this scenario is that, in conjunction with the solar photovoltaics, it will serve load at the west end of the island if the east end of the island were to be lost. And one of the key reasons for this is that there's a number of significantly important loads at the west end of the island, which includes the airport, fire and police, a National Guard site, and a couple of different campuses, school campuses that are used as emergency shelter. So this is my last slide, and it just shows a little more of the technical detail. It's a one-line diagram of the system. In the upper right-hand corner is the substation, which shows kind of existing generation and load there. And then the lower bottom left shows the substation where the existing 4.2 megawatt solar is currently connected, plus where the planned solar photovoltaics and battery energy storage system will connect. And the figure here on the left shows one of the potential contingency analyses from the results of a model that looks like the usefulness of the battery to manage the loss of the 69 kV feeder if it were to disconnect the island from the east and the west. The battery energy storage will be used for rapid injection of power to respond and maintain system power to these critical loads. So that's my last slide. We could go on to questions if there are any.
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate your presentation. Thanks, Otto, as well. I have a quick question. What technical challenges might exist when incorporating battery backup into an existing system? I don't know if you want to take it or if Otto wants to respond on this one.
I would say for backup power, as Emma stressed, there's the economic challenges, obviously. Is it worth the capital cost, a high capital cost for a battery energy storage system that you're just going to have and standby for emergency power? From a technical point of view, there's obviously the whole need to do all the necessary interconnection analyses. I think technically the biggest question is kind of identifying the peak load and the battery power that's required to support it. But other than that, I don't think it's much more difficult than interconnecting backup diesel generator if you're going to use the battery energy storage strictly for backup power. However, I think as Emma mentioned, battery is often seen as a Swiss Army knife, so it has multiple applications. And so I think one of the key challenges is when it's not being used strictly as backup, is making sure is not only using it, kind of monitoring the market, using it for load peak shaving, anticipating when the peak's going to happen, when you want to discharge it, but also then making sure that you have enough battery energy storage within the battery for these emergency scenarios. And so it becomes kind of a complex question about the optimization for all these use cases. But for backup only, I don't think it's that much more technically challenging than just a backup diesel generator.
Okay, thanks. And as you just mentioned, optimizing, I'll ask a second question. Maybe Dan can take this one. Not sure how familiar you are with REOPT, but could the REOPT model be used to optimize for a system or even for an island system in terms of including storage?
Yeah, REOPT was primarily formulated for behind the meter type scenarios. One of the important considerations for a larger island system, obviously, is the reliability question. And so, from the utility perspective, it's not all about saving money. It's making sure that the reliable power is there. And so there's a lot of, as the utility, the folks that are participating in this webinar who from the utility side understand a lot of the investments that they make with respect to the existing generation, for example, has to do with kind of the making sure they have N+1 backup generation at the power plant or spinning reserve in case of a contingency event. REOPT doesn't normally consider these contingency events. And so it can be used, but there's other models that utilities often use that consider not only the economics, but also the reliability and reserve requirements. And so for that one example I showed, that's a technical model that looks at system stability, but there's other techno-economic models similar to REOPT that specifically also consider the reliability requirements and the reserve requirements of the system that REOPT normally doesn't have.
All right. Okay, final question, again on REOPT. Is the software available on the NREL site, and do you need a license to access it?
Yeah, REOPT, and Emma might want to jump in on this. REOPT it's an open source software, so it's available to anybody to use. There's no licensing requirement. You just have to, if you download it and you do your own hacking with it, you'll just have to, you'll accept this common license, or you can access it through the REOPT website without even having to create a login, and you can use it for free. If you do create a login, then you can save certain analyses. But it is, yes, it's open source, it's publicly available. There's no licensing costs or requirements.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan, and thanks again, Otto, for starting us off with the case studies. We do appreciate the practical examples, and to share a few more practical examples, I now invite Jim Riley to be followed by Wallace Kenyon. They'll be sharing some more case studies with us, and then we'll take the questions after Wallace has presented.
Hi, everybody. I'll do the same thing as Dan, just do a mic check.
You're good to go.
Great, thank you. So I'm Jim Riley. I'm an electrical engineer at NREL. I focus on microgrid deployment. I typically work with like the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and ports and airports and things like that, trying to help them deploy renewable focused microgrids. I'll be talking about two different case studies at the same location in Kauai on Hawaii, at the Pacific Missile Range Facility, which is a Navy installation that we often partner with. So next slide, please. So this specific site, there's two different systems. One focuses on a bunch of rooftop PV arrays that are owned by the Navy, and the second system that I'll talk about a little bit later is a large 20 megawatt ground mount project that's owned and operated by the electric utility. So this first set of slides talks through those rooftop PV arrays and how it partners and works in tangent with energy storage. So as you can see sort of in the main components and sequence section, so there's the 945 kilowatt peak load for the historical load data that we have. There's a power plant that the generators range between 300 to 500 kilowatts each, and there's 6 of those. And the base runs this to segment off a portion of their load. And so they can run Pacific Missile Range Facility. They do tests on various missiles and things like that. So they don't want anyone to really have any impact on that. The Navy doesn't. So they disconnect that load and power it fully by diesel in a very small island, roughly a megawatt island on their own, separate from the Kauai grid. And that happens every day from roughly 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., 5 days a week, sometimes on weekends or for overnight and things like that too. So in the stages, so there were 6 rooftop PV arrays that were installed that do closely connect with that range ops section where there's the power plant. And then there's an administration area. That's where all the rooftop PV arrays are. Those were installed in 2010, about 600 kilowatts of solar PV on the roof was installed. And due to issues with export, and since that large load disconnects every day when the solar PV is producing, there were issues that the solar PV, the production would export onto the KIUC, the Kauai Island Utility Company's electric grid. Because of that, the utility required the installation to permanently curtail the capacity from 610 kilowatts down to 175 kilowatts. So they turned off 4 of those 6 PV arrays. In 2013, there was a phase 1 where they put in a flooded lead acid battery. This was Navy funded, and the effort was to try to enable the battery to absorb some of that PV power during the day instead of just curtailing it and turning it off, and also to enable increased rooftop PV production so that they could capture some more of that available sunlight, turn it into electricity. This effort brought the total available capacity up to about 465 kilowatts. And the way that this was done largely was by turning off the largest hangar, which had rooftop PV on the top. When they approached export to the utility, it would open a circuit breaker and turn off that solar PV. That still didn't fully enable all of the PV on the system. The Navy calls this the stranded PV project, but the batteries in that system helped to support power quality, absorbed some of the power during the day, and tried to shift it to the peaks, which typically occur around 5 p.m. And there's a slide on that 2 down from here. And just overall try to improve the operation of the system. That was sort of a large step in the right direction, and that increased the capacity to about 75% of its total capacity, but still the Navy considered this like a stranded PV asset. So in 2016, they initiated the effort in the partnership with the ESTCP program, which is the Department of Defense demonstration program, with KBR Wiley, Honeywell, with NREL partnering as well. Through this, they did firmware upgrades to the solar PV to enable it so that you don't turn on and off one large solar PV array to avoid exporting to the utility. You could actually take very minute increments off from 3 of those rooftop solar PV arrays. So initially what would happen is you would discharge the battery to try to shave your peak. When you hit the point where there was excess solar PV, the battery would then absorb power to again try to avoid just sort of dumping and wasting solar PV. This project is still ongoing, but there's a number of great benefits that we're planning to demonstrate, and I'm partnering closely with Dan Olis and a number of other folks at NREL on this. So with that, they're hoping to use the batteries and the solar PV to fully implement the solar PV, increase the power quality on the system, and also enable the batteries and the solar PV to work together with that large diesel power plant to try to reduce the amount of diesel fuel that's used by the Navy in this specific application. So James, next slide, please. So this shows sort of the 3 main operating modes on how the Navy plans to operate. On the left, There's the utility operation, just normal grid tied every day. And they still intend to disconnect the diesel generator with the CL, which is the critical load, the solar PVs, the battery, and a load on the other side will typically operate served by the utility. They have the current island mode, which is sort of the same, but then the diesel power plant isolates with the critical load, and the PV and batteries operates with the load there. On the far right, we're working with KBR and Honeywell to try to put in a microgrid controller, which will coordinate that big power plant, the solar PV, and both energy storage systems to enable the PV and the diesel so the PV won't reduce the visible load on the diesel generator so far that you see issues with things like wet stacking and other issues. And the battery can support power quality on the system and serve all of the loads in this specific area of the system. Next slide, please. So back in 2016-17 timeframe, Dan Olis and other members on our team, they did similar REOPT analysis that's been spoken about quite a bit today. One of the main focuses was how to optimize the dispatch of that battery to try to shave the largest peak. So if you can see here, this is a 5-day snapshot from a typical year, and each one of those large spikes is actually a nighttime. So during the day, you can see the spike where it's going up, and then the generators disconnect a significant portion of the load. That's why it drops down to 0. So the peaks are actually not in the middle of the day like typical heating and cooling or cooling loads that would be on Kauai. They actually occur just before 8 a.m., just after 5 p.m. So it is a little bit easier to try to time the dispatch of that energy storage system. And that's what Dan and the other folks on the REOPT team did. They used REOPT to model the potential opportunity for the energy storage to shave that peak. They were able to demonstrate a peak from 946 kilowatts to 776 kilowatts, which is a significant reduction if you have a demand charge, such as they do on Kauai. And as a part of this effort also, we supported some cybersecurity penetration testing to show that we can make the control system that dispatches the solar PV, the generators, and the battery as cyber secure as possible. It was sort of a third-party validation of the control system using some of the energy system integration facility, one of the labs we have here at NREL, and some super intelligent network engineers trying to sort of quote unquote hack into the system, but and just find any potential like threat and intrusion points. Next slide, please. This is just a little bit more detail talking about that cybersecurity penetration testing, showing that they took this is a very pared down example of the network that they did the analysis on. They, instead of having 4 network switches, they simplified it down to 1, and then we'll sort of translate a lot of the protocols and lessons learned across those other 4, for example. So we used an inverter that was the same as, this is actually the same inverter that's at PMRF. We just happen to have one here at the National Renewable Energy Labs ESIF facility. Next slide, please. So this specific example is a utility scale example. This is a partnership between KIUC, AES, and the US Navy. So again, it's on the Pacific Missile Range facility. The Navy has, I don't remember what the legal term is, but it's sort of barrier lands that are on the end of the installation that they're able to try to lease to partners for opportunities through a US code authority. They leased a number of acres to KIUC and AES so that they could deploy a 19.3 megawatt solar PV project and an energy storage system that was 30 megawatts, 70 megawatt hours. There's 2 main grid operating modes on this system. So during normal operation, AES will sell power to KIUC through a 25-year PPA. Most of the power on KIUC traditionally was served from diesel generation, but they do have a goal of trying to get to producing power 70% by 2030 by renewables, so 70% of renewables. So there's a significant shift. I think they're at about 65% was the last I saw right now. So they're very close to exceeding that goal, which is exciting. The PV and batteries here, the PV will definitely support that renewable goal directly, and the battery will support it indirectly. So with the significant amount of PV on that system, they sort of need to be able to shift some of that production to load at night and also support power quality on the system. So this, so KIUC will be partnering with AES to not only buy kilowatt hours, but also some of the stability benefits that a battery can bring to the system. And like Dan just mentioned, there's a ton of benefits that can come from energy storage. This is KIUC's way of sort of leveraging those benefits. So then the second operation for this system, which is really the Navy's main interest in pursuing this partnership, was the ability for the solar PV and batteries to island with the Pacific Missile Range Facility's load. Just like KIUC, the Navy also has goals of has a lot of reasons for trying to get away from diesel-fired generation. So in the event of a grid outage on KIUC, the solar PV and batteries was configured and designed to almost instantly transition the Pacific Missile Range Facility's loads to be served solely by that solar PV and battery system that's on their site. The load on KIUC or on PMRF, the Navy's installation, is a little over 2.5 to 3 megawatts. So this 20 megawatts of solar with 30 megawatts, 70 megawatt hours of energy storage, if it's in most scenarios, and NREL supported with some of this analysis, but most scenarios that they're pending any other significant distribution lines being taken out or extreme clouding events, the Pacific Missile Range Facility will basically never go offline because there's enough solar and energy storage to power this installation almost indefinitely, which is sort of the assumption here. So NREL supported this effort. So we had, like I mentioned, it's 20 megawatts of solar, 30 megawatts, 70 megawatt hours of energy storage, which is sort of small on KIUC, large on PMRF compared to the load. At NREL, we scaled all of this stuff down to a 430 kilowatt PV array that we have at our Flatirons campus, our wind test site up towards Boulder, Colorado, and scaled that 30 megawatt, 70 megawatt hour battery down to 1 megawatt hour. And we're able to demonstrate that ability to seamlessly transition from grid connected mode, the normal grid conditions operating mode, to the island mode, to show the Navy some of the benefits that this will bring to their system, which again, they're exchanging, instead of cash payments for a lease, they're getting energy resilience is what they're viewing it as. And then to support AES and KIUC to give them some confidence in the controls of the system, we did the same demonstration using the hardware at our Flatirons campus to show the power quality benefits that the solar PV and batteries can bring to the KIUC grid. So again, those are two significantly different systems that are bringing two definitely different benefits to PMRF, and the ESTCP project is a demonstration project to try to bring benefits to the broader Navy on how someone might deploy these things. This large system, I believe, was commissioned a couple of months ago, and they're doing final acceptance tests and things like that. The ESTCP project, the small rooftop solar one, that one is being commissioned, and the demonstration is in July of this year, so in about a month. That's the quick overview for these two. Are there any questions?
James, we'll take the question after the next presentation. Sure.
Okay, thank you.
So Wallace?
Great. Just a quick mic check. Seems like it's working.
Yes, you're good.
Good. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. So my name is Rick Wallace Kenyon. I'm a researcher with NREL and the University of Colorado Boulder. And today we're going to be talking about inverter-based operation of power systems, in particular electromagnetic transient simulations, which we'll talk about, and grid forming inverters. And all of this is happening with a model that we have of the Maui power system. So we're working with the Hawaiian Electric Company closely through this whole process. Next slide. Okay, so the focus here is, it's going to be a little bit different than what we've been talking about so far in this webinar, but we're looking at the general stability, resilience, and also the capability to simulate these power systems with very high penetrations of inverter-based resources. And we're looking at the dynamics here. So rather than looking at sort of energy imbalance and just sort of general energy metrics, we're actually looking at short-term dynamics of the system. And what we're interested in is, what are the impacts to the power system as we get to these high penetrations of renewables? Of course, renewables typically interfaced with inverters. And also another question that we have is, are these traditional dynamic simulation softwares sufficient to capture these changing dynamics? Of course, storage plays a key role in these systems, both as, a source of headroom, but also, as we're going to talk about this grid forming inverter control, it turns out if you want to have an inverter operate as a grid forming device, it needs to have available energy to modulate power output. It's really just the mechanics of maintaining your frequency in an AC power system. You have to have available energy. There's of course many others, but I'm not going to dig too deep into that. So next slide. Right, and just to highlight again, we're looking at short-term dynamics here. So these are sub-seconds, inertial timescales in seconds, so primary frequency response timescales. We're looking at voltages and frequencies, and we're doing faults on these power systems. We're looking at unexpected losses of generation, and also system strength decreases, which is really a ramification of having more of these inverters in the system. So just some plots on the right to show you what we're talking about. So sort of voltage angles on the top, or frequency dips after generation losses, or voltage profiles post faults. Okay, next slide. So here is just a little discussion about how it's really just to drive home this idea that we're talking about power delivery as opposed to sort of energy. On the left, you have two charts, which is a toy system. And on the top, we're looking at the instantaneous penetration of inverter-based resources. And on the bottom, you're looking at a very basic dispatch stack. 3 generation sources here, biomass, which we could, just accept as a synchronous generation sourced power on your system. And then there's wind energy and solar energy. And then the idea here is just to show you that throughout 24 hours, you can have a substantial variation in your instantaneous penetration. You can see, sort of very early in the day, it's up by 75%, and then it goes all the way down to 0 by, hour 20. And the reason why this is important is that with respect to the dynamics that we're looking at, many of the challenges that are associated with these high inverter-based resource penetrations are a function of the power being delivered at a particular time. So it's not the aggregate energy delivered over a period of time. So with respect to the dynamics that I'm looking at, we would very much grab a snapshot of this system, at these high instantaneous penetrations and take a peek at what's going on with the dynamics. So next slide. Okay, so we're going to do a real quick discussion about these different types of generation sources. This will be a bit of background, probably familiar to most of you, but just to drive home the differences between, these historical synchronous generators and inverters. Of course, what you're looking at here, that is a toy synchronous generator on the left. You can see the stator coils and the rotor coils. And essentially with the synchronous generator, the goal is to impart some sort of combusted gas or hydro on a turbine. It's also known as a prime mover. And then you rotate a shaft within this synchronous generator, which induces voltage outputs in these stator coils. So that's how you get this very beautiful sinusoidal waveform. And it's important to understand that a synchronous generator, notated here as an SG, naturally generates this sinusoidal output. So it's a geometric design. That's how the device is operating. And with respect to a power system, when a synchronous generator is parallel connected to some network, it acts as a voltage source to the power system. And you also have this large mass, which is the rotor and the prime mover. Those have inertia, and because you have this electromagnetic coupling between the rotor and these rotating masses within the generator and the output voltage waveforms, you end up embedding inertial characteristics in your voltage waveforms. So you've probably heard discussions about decreases in inertia. That's really what we're talking about here. It's a de facto source of energy to the power system. And of course, synchronous generators with respect to some load generation imbalance, what happens is the rotor will slow down or speed up, and then you have a governor that senses that change in rotational velocity, and then it'll increase or decrease the amount of power being fed to the prime mover. Next slide. And then, of course, the other player here is the inverter. And conventionally, if you're looking at a larger power system, if you're going to integrate renewables with an inverter, whether solar or wind, you're going to use what's called a grid following inverter. And what these devices do is they use something called a phase locked loop to assess the voltage waveform at the point of interconnection. And by determining what this waveform is doing, it really is teasing out an angle here. It bases all of its control objectives on what this phase lock loop derives as the angle of the power system. Hence, we call these grid following inverters because it assumes the presence of this particular waveform. Within the inverter, there are all of these dynamical control systems. There's, of course, the phase lock loop, and there are intercurrent loops and power loops and auxiliary control and all sorts of really good and interesting stuff. But at the end of the day, it's important to keep in mind that these inverters explicitly rely on the presence of the voltage waveform in order to operate. Just to throw out that we're not actually modeling pulse width modulation control in these studies, but probably not too much of a concern. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. Great, okay. So here is just a fun little bears on bicycle analogy. You'll recall that these synchronous generators, we consider them grid forming devices. They are voltage sources to the network. And then these grid following devices are, they assume the presence of a voltage waveform. So this is just a fun little way to think conceptually about what might happen to our power system as we transition to more and more of these grid following inverters, which are, of course, how we're integrating the renewables on the power system. So if the grid forming asset is just your full scale bicycle, it's an autonomous system by itself. It can go forward, you can steer it, you can accelerate and deaccelerate. We could appreciate the inverter based, these grid following inverters as the tag-along bicycle here. So you can actually propel with it and you can try to slow down that system, but you can't really steer. And you also, you're not actually going to create a viable system on your own. So of course, if everything's grid forming via the larger bear, everything's happy and the system works. But all the way to the right, if you have no grid forming assets on your system, it's not going to work. You don't have a viable power system. The big question in dynamics research today is where these tipping points are. It seems to be highly system specific and also inverter specific. And we're going to look at the Maui system a little bit to see where we bump into those problems. Okay, so just fun little cartoon there. Yeah, okay, so next slide. And finally, the buzzword in the dynamics community these days are these grid forming inverters. So you'll recall with the grid following inverter, where you explicitly rely on this voltage waveform, a grid forming inverter instead generates its own AC voltage waveform at the output terminals. So whereas a grid following device acts as a current source to your network, these actually act as a voltage source. The control schemes are designed to accomplish various power flow objectives. And an important thing to note, again, with these grid forming inverters is that they require headroom, which could either be storage, battery storage, or could be curtailed solar or something like that. Important to note that grid forming inverters are not a new technology. They've been used for decades in off-grid and islanded applications. There's been discussion today so far about transitioning between grid connected mode and islanded mode. That would really be a transition between grid following mode, likely. That's what I'm assuming, to what would be islanded mode, where the inverter would actually be acting as a grid forming inverter. What is new and challenging to the community is having grid connected, grid forming inverters in parallel with synchronous generators and or these other grid following inverters. So that's really what we're starting to look at. So next slide. So we've talked about our devices. This is just a quick plug to electromagnetic transient simulations. So if you were going to do dynamic simulations, you would typically use what's called a positive sequence simulation tool, so PSSE or PSLF. Now these, with respect to conventional power systems and historical power systems, these are sufficient to capture these electromechanical modes, but they are operating in the phasor domain, so they don't actually model waveforms, and they can miss these faster dynamics. Of course, with all these inverters, which have these very fast inner control loops, there's starting to be a realization in the community that we may need something that does model these waveforms, such as electromagnetic transient simulations, to capture all of the relevant dynamics with these high inverter-based systems. So, one of the things we're looking at here is we're modeling the Maori system in the phasor domain and also in the EMT domain to understand how these simulation tools differ. Of course, why is this a problem? Or why is it a challenge, rather? And that's because these EMT simulations are orders of magnitude slower. So if you want to do some contingency analysis on your system, we're talking you would require hours to do a single simulation with EMT as opposed to seconds with your phasor domain. Okay, so next slide. So with some quick Maui background, it's of course an island in Hawaii. HECO, Hawaiian Electric Company, expects Maui to be the first large island capable of operating with 100% inverter-based power resources, possibly by 2023. A 2020 peak with inverter-based resources, they got up to 89.5%. Recall our previous conversation about how it's this peak instantaneous penetration that is really where things start to get tricky. Maui is, of course, a small island. It's 200 megawatts peak, but it does have a mesh transmission system and a 69 kV voltage backbone. So it makes it really interesting for these sorts of simulation studies we're looking at. So NREL is doing these EMT studies with PSCAD, so it's Power Systems Computer Aided Design. And just a real quick thing to point out that these are just, like the studies we're doing are just very, very small steps in a very complex due diligence process that is required to operate Maui in this sort of unprecedented way. So next slide. So basically, we have this base case, which is a 96% inverter-based resources where everything's operating, it's grid following. There are these big hybrid power plants. So these are batteries with solar, 60 MVA inverter and a 15 MVA inverter. The 60 MVA is actually a few inverters. These are grid following devices. And the inertia ends up being, inertia here being a proxy for sort of the voltage resources, voltage forming resources on the system. The inertia is at a reasonable level because there are a huge amount of synchronous condensers on the system. By huge, I mean 6, but that's quite a lot anyways. So it's providing about 75% of this voltage forming asset. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is we start with scenario 1, which is all of these synchronous condensers online. And then we take 2 of them offline, and then we take 2 of them offline again to go from S2 to S3. And then finally, just to sort of show that the system isn't working with only grid following devices, we also look at that scenario 7. So we're going to do phasor domain simulations and also EMT simulations to see how they differ. So next slide. So what you're looking at here are frequency traces of the Maui power system. The red is a phase lock loop derived frequency, and the green is rotor speed of one of the synchronous generators on the system. There are only 3 very small synchronous generators online at this time. And we can see differences between the scenario 1 and scenario 2, where we're taking 2 of those synchronous condensers offline. But then when we get to scenario 3, we see very, very large differences between both the system responses, but also the phasor domain simulation tools actually don't work in scenario 3. So you can't see the traces, but they end up stopped in just a few seconds after the perturbation. The perturbation is a fault at a low short circuit ratio bus. So it's important to note here that these frequencies would not be acceptable anyways, but they're, we're trying to do an analysis to understand how these tools differ and what happens as we go to lower and lower inertia and or voltage sources on the network. So for that aim, we were disabling ride through and under frequency load shed and all that good stuff. But when you get to scenario 3, we see that the oscillatory modes are not very well damped at all. And also scenario 7 is not shown, but you'll recall that one had no voltage sources and that system just didn't work. So next slide. So if we look at the loss of generation, again, we're looking at scenario 1 and scenario 3. As expected, we're having a lower nadir with less inertia. You're having a larger rate of change of frequency as well. But also interesting to note is particularly in the phase lock loop derived frequency, we're seeing these larger oscillations again. So even though it's not a direct voltage perturbation via a fault, we're still starting to see this controller instability. And again, where the idea here is that this is likely due to the phase lock loop of the grid following inverters. The next slide. This is just a real quick plug to show we could actually change the complexity of the dynamic control systems in PSCAD, our EMT simulator. And we were trying to understand what's actually changing as we go to this, the instability in these lower inertia systems. And it turns out that if you're not modeling the full order of those inverters, which is really including the intercurrent loops, we're not actually capturing the oscillations that are seen. And you can see that the green traces are the highly oscillatory frequency responses. That's where we're modeling the full intercurrent and power loops. So the main takeaway here is that you do actually need to be modeling the full order of your inverters to capture relevant dynamics. So next slide. Okay, so real quick chat. Here we're putting grid forming inverters on the system, and we're not actually adding any devices. All we're doing is simply changing the control scheme from one grid following inverter, a 30 MVA device at a hybrid power plant, to a grid forming inverter. And we're going to look at the scenario 3 system response just to see how things changed. And we're just going to look at an easy generation loss. So here we're looking at, this is on the left, you've seen this plot before, that's the HPP as a GFL, and then simply changing to this grid forming control. So we're changing the HPP from acting as a current source to acting as a voltage source. And clearly there is a substantial increase in primary damping and a major reduction in these faster modes. So it was a helpful change. So next slide. And the next slide is just to show you what's actually going on with respect to power flow from these HPPs. If you notice the red trace here on the left, that's when that HPP is acting as a grid following device. And you can see there's the generation loss happens at 1 second, and there's a delay because the grid following inverter actually can't do anything until it senses that the frequency is changing, where the frequency change is actually driven by the synchronous machines on the system. But then if you look at the HPP as a grid forming device, that's an instantaneous extraction of power from that device, which sort of shows you why it's acting as more of a source of damping for the system. So it's better to think about, when you're doing a grid forming control with an inverter, it's actually that the network is extracting power from the device as opposed to, being a grid following device where you're injecting power into the system, which is itself a type of disturbance. Okay, so next slide. So a quick summary, we're finding that phasor domain simulations are having a tough time modeling these high inverter-based resource systems. You need to model all of your intercurrent loops. Of course, these are aggregate models, but if you're not modeling the full complexity of your controllers, you're going to miss some of these faster modes in the system. And another thing that we're finding is that these grid forming inverters seem to be helping the system substantially. It's mitigating this instability, but presumably you would need 2 of these GFMs for some sort of N-1 reliability. And finally, it's important to know that these simulations we're looking at transient stability here, but there are so many other things to look at about operating your system as 100% IVRs, such as protection and reserves and resource adequacy and all of that. So I believe that's it.
Okay, thanks so much, Rick. And thanks again to our previous presenter, Jim. So we have a couple of questions. The first question is for you, Rick, and then we'll have a follow-up question from a participant who will ask their question live. And so the question is about unintentional islanding. Is that an issue? And how is it being dealt with?
With respect to the Maui system work that we're doing, it's not something we're looking at because we're not really appreciating, the individual pieces of the system. We're looking at the system more holistically. So we're actually looking at the entire transmission system and looking at these, it is an island, of course, on its own, but we're not, you could lose a generation asset. If it was an inverter, it could, in theory, create its own island, but that's sort of out of the scope of the project we're looking at.
Okay, all right, no problem. We have another follow-up, similar. This one is also about inverters. Would an inverter at I'm guessing battery energy solar system be considered a grid forming inverter? I'm guessing that's the question. They're using some acronyms. I'm making assumptions here.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's actually what makes these two different types of control so interesting. If you had an inverter at a battery energy storage, it could be grid forming. It isn't necessarily a grid forming device. And the reason why I make the distinction is if you have some rooftop solar with no storage asset, chances are you're just trying to do maximum power extraction from that solar array. So you're actually going to operate as a grid following inverter because all you're doing is tracking the existing power system and trying to inject as much power as possible. But if you have a battery, then you have the ability to regulate frequency because you can actually supply these, either, potentially very small load generation balances or very large ones as well. So that's a very important distinction to keep track of, is that, with battery backup on an inverter, you can become a grid forming inverter.
Okay, all right, thanks so much. And now we'll invite Gail Delisle to ask her question live. Gail, you may go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Penny, are you all hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay then, thank you very much. Richard, the question is for you, and it is a little more in depth into what you answered on the inverters, and it's based on an experiment I was part of 25 years ago on campus, but when I was doing my degree. So, but I remembered it. So we used the phase lock loop, and we connected it in series and in parallel on trial to see whether the phase lock loop systems would provide grid following. And both times it failed, it didn't. Now, the reason I made that distinction is that, is it now that the new inverters now have an automatic grid forming device? And if so, up to how much power can a system provide without storage to stabilize using the inverters as the grid forming devices?
Okay, I think I understood the question. So the idea here is that most new inverters are not, well, again, grid forming inverters exist on microgrids all over the world. And if you're going to do some isolated system, it will be a grid forming inverter. But the main thing to appreciate is that if it's a reasonably sized power system and you're trying to supply inverter-based resources to it, you're going to be using a grid following technology, and you will have this phase lock loop. That's sort of what conventional technology is today. So there are phase lock loops in all of these rooftop solar plants in the Maui power system. With respect to, if you were to put a grid forming inverter on those power systems and, sort of neglecting a whole lot of other potential dynamical issues due to fault responses and protection and everything, the grid forming inverter, if the battery system is well tuned, could supply a fair amount of power to the system, which again is going to happen based on, the laws of AC power transfer. If the network says that it has some power deficit, and the grid forming device is trying to regulate frequency, then it will naturally supply that power to the network. So it's one of the main takeaways, is that grid forming devices supplying power to the network, it doesn't really need to be appreciated as a disturbance, whereas, this grid following technology supplying power does.
So you're saying, Richard, are you now saying that you don't need to use for bigger systems I'm speaking about, right? So like systems over 50 megawatts. Is it then that we don't have to use the storage, or we will have to use the storage to help stabilize the system?
You will need storage. You can't be a grid forming device without having storage.
Okay then.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Gail. Thanks, Rick, and thanks again, Jim. And so now we get into our final set of presentations. We are running a little behind schedule, so I invite you, if possible, to remain with us as we will go beyond our scheduled closing of 12 Eastern Caribbean time. If you cannot remain with us, the session is also being streamed live on YouTube, so you will be able to catch the rest of the session if you have to leave at the scheduled 12 o'clock closing time. So we've spoken quite a bit about storage, we've heard about microgrids, we've looked at some modeling, and now we want to talk to you about how we could support you in ensuring that your projects, once they have been designed, can get that support to ensure that they're bankable and you can get some funding. We'll also have a look at some of the other regulatory concerns. And I invite you now to listen to our colleague Gerald Lindo, and Gerald will be followed by Mark from Get Invest. Gerald?
Oh dear. Thank you, Sherry-Ann, and thank you everybody who's still with us. I will be moving quickly just in the interest of time. As was pointed out, this is at the end of the series of capacity buildings in the IRP sessions. So now that you've gone through an IRP, you've done some of the analyses that we spoke about earlier today, what do you need to do to get from an idea, from some modeling, from some good propositions to actual projects in the ground? Well, the CREI is here to help with that. I want to introduce you very briefly to a mechanism called the Project Preparation Facility that we house. Now, what is the PPF? The PPF is basically a go-to facility for converting promising commercially viable RE and EE project concepts into, oh dear, sorry, advancing too fast here. Turning the concepts into tangible and bankable projects that can easily attract financing for implementation to build environmental and economic sustainability. And as I think would be obvious, we think at CREI that storage falls underneath that because of the benefits to resilience, because of how well it pairs with renewable energy. We do this work in partnership with many partners, not least, well, they're all laid out at the bottom of the screen there. CARICOM, the Technical Assistance Program for Sustainable Energy in the Caribbean, which is funded by the EU, specifically German cooperation, as well as our partners in PFAN and Get Invest. We're going to hear from a colleague from Get Invest right after me. Briefly, what support does the PPF provide? Well, we provide technical assistance and advisory services for project advancement towards practical investments. This includes matchmaking services between project proponents and project financiers through specialized investment and business promotion forums, maintenance and expansion of regional project pipelines, so we can get a lot of action going in the region and try to aggregate and overcome these economies of scale that we have. We also have cooperation with global LAC and regional focus programs and initiatives and projects through various cooperation agreements, and provide support to financial institutions to build capacity in sustainable energy projects and developing financial instruments to support them. The business process in brief is that we try to originate projects. So we create awareness of the PPF, we do outreach to project proponents, and we try to receive applications into our system. We select eligible candidates for our support from that pool that we get. We provide that support to the projects through targeted TA and advisory services, and then we promote the projects, again, trying to match-make them or make a match with potential financiers. For now, all of these services are free. What are these services? It ranges from business plan refinement to project financial modeling and documentation, equity offer terms, financier introductions, technical validation and technical feasibility studies, environmental and social validation, and the list goes on. We're very flexible. Whatever you need to get your project over the hump, let's say you need a little extra study here, some extra modeling there, an introduction to a financier there, we can provide those services to any project proponent. Eligibility is broad. This list is, at least in terms of the technologies, is indicative, not exhaustive. As long as it supports renewable energy and energy efficiency, as long as it's pushing the technology ball forward and getting the Caribbean towards a greener future, we will support it. We do require, though, that the PPF candidates have a project location that is in one of the member states of CARICOM. You see the flags to the right side of the screen there. We also like it if people who are applying to the PPF at least have an idea of the site, the resource, and the technology that's going to be at play in their project. After today, I'm sure some of those technologies will be energy storage. We also, in the course of our work with a particular project proponent, we look at the off-taker for an energy source, any permitting issues, any issues of the team that's going to construct the thing. and also capital and construction needs as well. It's the part of the REOPT framework that we borrowed from NREL and that we apply to our PPF candidates. Very finally, and I hope I didn't go over time, I would direct any of you who are interested in making your energy project real. You have a good storage idea, but you just need to get something bankable that you can take to the bank. Visit us at ccre.org/ppf or write to ppf@ccre.org and we can get the ball rolling together. At this time, I want to turn over to one of our partners in this process, in the delivery of these PPF services, GetInvest. Mark, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Hi, my name is Mark Hankins. I'm coming from Nairobi, so it's a little bit later here than it is where you are. And I'm a solar energy engineer and a member of the GetInvest team. I've been working on solar projects in East Africa for 30 years. So what I want to talk about is business models, solar and storage business models in the SIDS. So what are the drivers and what are the challenges? We've heard a lot about the technologies. So what I'd like to talk about is, well, what are the real models and how do they work? Well, in East Africa, we've had quite a bit of solar installations and wind, and storage is beginning to become a thing here. So let me take you through a quick presentation. First, I'll talk to you about who I'm working with. I'm working with GetInvest, which is a partner, and GetInvest is a European Union supported program, which we offer advisory support with our Finance Catalyst team, about 25 advisors. And the European Union recognized that there are a lot of very good projects out there, and there are a lot of good sources of impact investment and grant and equity financing. But bringing the two together is difficult. So we in the Finance Catalyst team help to bring those together. And so we mobilize the private sector and we provide a Swiss Army knife of project development support, but mostly in investment and identifying where you can find finance for projects. And so you heard about the PPF in the last presentation, so I won't go into that was an adequate, great presentation. So if you're interested, you can get our support through the project preparation facility. So that's how you would be able to access our advisory support. So moving on, what I want to talk about is, so what type of projects make sense, and how do you categorize a project that would be worthy of investment support? So we've heard the technical side, and NREL, you guys are great. It's really great to hear what's being done on the technology side. We are really moving fast. So I'm based in Nairobi, and the solar and the wind markets here are actually moving quite fast, and storage is becoming a major thing. So what I want to do is go through some of the business scenarios that might be of interest. So we private sector opportunities are becoming viable quickly. So we can divide them into off-grid and on-grid. So first I want to talk about off-grid. And one thing that East Africa has in common with the Caribbean is that there are a lot of say off-grid sites, tourism on islands where there's a need for off-grid energy. And so those would be standalone systems, mini grids, and I think electric transport is part of that, because more and more we're seeing electric cars as part of the whole as part of the whole solutions. Small island communities are beginning to shift from diesel to solar battery for financial and environmental reasons. So we're seeing that these markets are gonna grow. And so again, we can look at standalone systems in single buildings. We can look at small islands where there's a need for a mini grid, and that it's again, I think that electric transport is going to be a key market in this sector. So that's the off-grid energy market. Let's look at the business models for grid-connected storage. So we heard a little bit about it from the technical side. I want to talk about it from the business model side. So in Kenya, in the last 3 years, we've added 100 megawatts of grid-connected solar. We call it commercial and industrial solar. And this is solar that, because power is expensive, as it is in the Caribbean, a lot of industries and tourism sites are shaving their power costs by putting solar on their roofs. So we call that C&I. And when you look at how storage can be used to support that, there are, in a business case, we can look at first of all, weak grid support, and that would be that would be backup power. So that's very quick, 5 minutes. And again, you will need a grid forming inverter, but you won't need a very large battery bank to help you get through those short periods. So we have C&I short-term storage and power stabilization. Then we have the longer term to get off generators for a few hours at a time or days at a time, and that's a much larger market, but that's another set of grid connect, and it needs much larger battery systems. So then another very common opportunity is small business and residential. So there's a lot of grid connected businesses that want to shave their power costs or have short-term storage systems. So small business and residential, upper middle class, and again, transport is part of the grid connected storage needs. So in short, when you look at business models, you can divide it into 3 categories. One is instantaneous, for 5 minutes at a time. The second is hours at a time. And the third is long-term, days at a time power support on grid connected storage. All of these are of interest in the East Africa region, and with the cost of batteries coming down, we're going to see these become the business case for all of these grow rapidly. There are regulatory issues when you look at the business. So in East Africa, we don't have net metering, unlike the States. I'm not sure about the Caribbean, but I would imagine that many parts of the Caribbean don't have net metering or wheeling in the market. So you can't sell your excess power that you generate onto the grid, and that's a huge implication for your business model, because you basically have to eat any excess power you produce or store it. So storage becomes more important when you don't have net metering. Secondly, in a lot of small island states in African countries, the private sector is pushing the government to make the changes. The governments don't move as fast as the private sector does, because these business opportunities are of interest to the private sector. So the private sector has to work with government to get them to make the changes. So I see that also. I'm I haven't been to the Caribbean for a long time, but I imagine that you're going to have the issue of the private sector pushing the government. And unlike Europe and the US, we don't necessarily have tax exempt environments for solar equipment. So that's an important consideration. And battery storage is a difficult sell for countries that are having trouble balancing the books. So there's regulatory issues that need to be looked at in all the business models. And again, net metering is not a thing in a lot of small countries. The drivers for the markets are what's causing the markets to grow rapidly. Price reductions for batteries are happening very rapidly. So the cost price for storage is 137 kilowatt hours, $137 per kilowatt hour. This is a cost price. The actual installation price is going to be about twice, even 3 times that. But prices are falling rapidly. There was a time a few years ago when they didn't think it was ever going to get below $100 per kilowatt hour, but we're going to get there. Prices have been really coming down. Lithium ion prices are falling rapidly. Developing consumer market niches. We are seeing the households and businesses saying, you know what, we're tired of having to deal with the grid. We're having to blackout, so we want to have our own ability to generate our own power. So we want to go green. So developing consumer market niches are really becoming a major component that's driving the market forward. And battery technology, we're moving off of lead acid. Lithium ion is kind of taking over the market, but there are other battery technologies. Capacitor batteries are really good for short-term storage as well. And the solar PV market development, we're seeing the price of solar getting, it's much less than grid power. So falling prices create new markets, and that leads to new demand. With increased demand, we see better technologies, we see more players entering the market, and then as the private sector moves forward, we see a better regulatory infrastructure. Governments become more accustomed to the renewable technologies. So in East Africa, where I'm sitting right now, things are moving very quickly. As I said, 100 megawatts of behind the meter C&I solar installed in Kenya in the last 3 years. That's in a grid that has 2.5 gigawatts. That's quite a big number. Challenges for market development: technical capacity, market awareness, and confidence. With things developing as quickly as they are, a lot of people want to see it happen. So the confidence in the technology is not quite there. And when you have cowboys in the market, then that decreases confidence. Financing for businesses and financing for the consumers. So business invest, we can help businesses identify the investment. But at the same time, we need to figure out ways to help consumers pay for the equipment, because it won't work if they have to buy all the equipment up front all at once. And finally, the challenges of government regulations and grid acceptance. With more and more variable renewables on the grid, there's a challenge, as we've seen from the other presentations. So, but the experience that we've seen is that the storage markets are going to follow the development of the solar and wind markets, and we're seeing very rapid developments, and from East Africa, I can say that in 5 years, we've moved very far. So if there's interest in applying to the facility, you can, there's the website so you can apply to the PPF facility right there. And I think I've finished the presentation, so happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark, and thanks, Gerald, for your presentation before. I have a question for Gerald. You mentioned the types of projects that are funded, but is there an upper or lower limit in terms of the size of the projects that could approach the PPF for technical assistance and matching for funding? Gerald, you are muted.
Sorry about that. Yes, in terms of a limit, we have spoken of a number in the past, but I believe that we are approaching this one flexibly. For now, I wouldn't want to give up particular limits either way. We're accepting all comments for the time being. In the future, we may put some limits around that.
Okay, all right. Thanks so much, Gerald. The next question, I think we may need one of our NREL colleagues to weigh in on this one. Touching on the topic of unintentional islanding again, one moment, just lost the question. Okay, here we go. Right. The Sandia 2012 report has spoken about the risk when there is a 67% generation to load balance. When we speak about going near 100% renewable, how will unintentional islanding be addressed? And this is particularly concerning where, for instance, maintenance needs to be carried out on the line when renewables are connected on a hot, cloudless day, for example, in the case of photovoltaics. I'm not sure which one of our NREL colleagues wants to respond to this one. Okay, James?
Sorry, are you hearing me?
Yes, I'm hearing you now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I know several of our speakers had to step off. They had another commitment. So we can, well, this is sent by an anonymous attendee. I was going to say I could forward the question and we can follow up with it afterwards.
Okay, all right, no problem. We can, so we will have to send, post the answer to that question and share with all our participants after the session. Another question coming in, which technologies are most representative or adequate to include in the energy system, and which models could be recommended to evaluate the integration of energy storage within the energy mix? I'm not sure who wants to take this, or if Gerald, if you want to weigh in on.
I might weigh in on that one.
Okay.
Which question was this one again?
So which technologies are most representative or adequate to include in the energy system? I'm going to make an assumption that's a system similar to what you'd find in the Caribbean, and sure. Which models would you recommend to evaluate the integration of energy storage in the energy mix?
That's a very broad question, but in terms of which technologies, these days I'm a big fan of solar because of the way the prices have been performing and because of how nicely it pairs with storage, and also the flexibilities that exist in the way you can install it. It's not like hydro or wind where you need a lot of really site-specific matters to be addressed, or you have to worry about having a long lead time in terms of gathering data on resource. Solar, by comparison, can deploy fairly quickly. Now, how do you assess, or how do you what tools you use to model your particular solar plant? Now, that depends on the level of analysis you're looking at, right? If you're thinking from the utility level, thinking about integrating that solar plant and what the interconnection of that plant will do to the grid, you're talking about tools like Plexus, you're talking about tools like Dixieland, Power Factory, others exist. If you're thinking about the facility level, you've heard one tool today, there are many others. There's REOPT, there's PV-Syst, Red Screen out of Canada is a good tool as well for like a project level evaluation. But it really depends on what you want to do this analysis for. And it's really the same question for what kind of technology. It really depends on the application, what the particular facility is meant to do, whether it's
in home or for off-grid.
A home or for off-grid, there's another one, yeah.
Okay, all right, thanks, Gerald. Thanks, Mark. One final comment. Mark, when you were presenting, you had mentioned net wheeling and net billing. In the Caribbean, most of the territories actually either have a net metering or net wheeling policy in place or in the draft stages. So we have been making significant strides in the region to allow persons to be able to benefit financially from that interconnection. And with that, we have come to the close of what has been a very informative session on energy storage and how that will help us as a region to build resilience. Thanks to our presenters from NREL, from the CROIX, and from Get Invest. You led us ably through the content, and from the numerous questions that we have, you've engaged our audience, and we appreciate that. Thank you to our CROIX team who continue to ensure the quality of our capacity building sessions. This series has definitely been a long and a good one, and we appreciate the value that you add in terms of availing yourself for each session. Thank you to our participants. You have been with us, especially to those of you who've given us that extra 18 minutes. We really appreciate you being here with us today. And we invite you to give us your feedback on today's activities so that we can continue to improve the offerings from the CROIX to benefit the region. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks, Sherry, and peace and love, everybody.
Bye-bye.